I'm Lisa Rangeli. I'm NCRP's Senior Director of Assessment and Special Projects. And there we go. I've been at NCRP for 10 years, and most recently I've been working on our Philanthropy initiative and on the Power Moves guide with my colleague Caitlin Duffy, who's helping out behind the scenes but has been fully a co-partner in this process all along the way. So in case you aren't that familiar with NCRP, we've been around for over 40 years, and our commitment all through that time has been to amplify the voices of nonprofits and the communities that philanthropy seeks to benefit in conversations about philanthropy's goals and impact. We've consistently advocated for philanthropy that benefits and engages under-resourced and marginalized communities and advances systemic change. I'm really thrilled to see over my decade at NCRP that issues of equity are really becoming more front and center in philanthropic conversations. And I'm excited to help foundations and donors think more strategically and mindfully about the role of power in making equity a reality. So to give you a little snapshot of who registered for the webinar today, let's get a sense of who's here. So of the 250 registrants for today's presentation, nearly half are from grant-making institutions. We've broken them out here according to type of foundation, but added up, it's a majority of those who signed up today. But we also have a good number of peers from nonprofits, other philanthropy-serving organizations, and consulting firms. And you'll see that a majority of those who answered who signed up, not a majority, but the largest number, rather, I should say, are national foundations. And then we have a good distribution from different parts of the country. And for those of you who do work nationally or work in the Southeast, we want to make sure that you know about our As the South Grows initiative, and we'll definitely be sharing follow-up information about that. Our final report for that project is coming out in the just next few weeks, so we want to make sure folks are aware of that. So now we just have to get through a few housekeeping issues. So you can use the Q&A and chat features both. We ask that you use the Q&A box if you want to communicate with me and with our speakers, and use the chat box for any questions that you might have for the full group, or comments or resources that you want to share with other folks. We'll do a special call for resource sharing at the end, but wanted to alert you to that. Caitlin, my colleague, will be monitoring the Q&A. And if you have any technical issues, you can chat her directly for assistance, but don't chat the full group. So with that said, we also just want to encourage you to be active on social media during and after the presentation. So the hashtag is PowerMovesEquity, and our hosts are listed here as well. And I think Han is on Twitter, and I can't remember if Marcelo and Gita are, but feel free to tweet out about them as well. So I actually want to now introduce our folks, but first I'm going to go through briefly what we'll cover today. So we'll just give a brief overview of Philanthropy and of the Power Moves guide. Hopefully you've had a chance to download the executive summary beforehand, but if not, we'll try to give you a brief overview. If not, download the full toolkit. We'll have brief introductions. We'll have a moderated discussion that I think will be very interesting to help people get oriented and think about how to get started with the Power Moves. Then we want to open it up for Q&A and discussion among the full group of participants, which will be through the Q&A feature. We have a couple of polls at different points, and then we want to close out with final thoughts and, again, suggestions of additional resources. So I'm thrilled to have Gita, Han, and Marcella with me today. There are three people who are all passionate about and committed champions of intersectional equity that is centers race. Geeta Gulati-Parti is founder and president of Open Source Leadership Strategies. She's the author of 2 of our Philanthropy Foundation assessments, and she served as a member of our advisory committee to create Power Moves. And now she is a member of our Power Moves advisory and peer learning group for consultants. And we'll be saying more about those peer learning groups soon. And I just have to say personally that Geeta has been a very invaluable mentor to me on my journey in racial equity and how it applies to research and evaluation through my work at NCRP. So I'm very grateful. Han Lee is executive director of the Weisberg Foundation, which is a grant-making supporter of NCRP. And Han is also representing her foundation as a participant in our Power Moves advisory and peer learning group for funders. So we're really thrilled to have her leadership today. Marcelo Bonta is a principal at the Raven Group. He spent 2 years as a fellow at the Meyer Memorial Trust, which was an Impact Award recipient from NCRP last year. And Marcelo also graciously served as a reviewer of our draft Power Moves toolkit and gave us really important insights that helped us as we finalized it. And Marcelo is also part of the Power Moves advisory and peer learning group for consultants. So you can read more about their bios, and they'll also get a chance to say a little bit about themselves and their organizations, but now you have the brief synopsis. So now we're going to just very briefly give you an overview of Philanthropy and of the toolkit, and then get right into discussion, which is going to be the most interesting and meaty part of this webinar. So NCRP launched Philanthropy 4 years ago, and we wanted to break through what we call the isolation bubble that many funders experience because of the deference of their peer funders, the kind of culture of niceness in philanthropy, and the very justifiable fear that many nonprofit leaders feel that keeps them from really challenging and critiquing philanthropic practice. As we hear all the time, once you become a philanthropist, suddenly all your jokes are funny and all your insights are brilliant. It's very hard to push through that bubble to get to some real valuable feedback. Toward that end, we created a foundation assessment tool, which included confidential surveys and interviews with stakeholders as a central part of the assessment process. We also built a web platform to share assessment results publicly and invite reactions to our findings. We did a dozen in-depth assessments of major foundations who are among the nation's largest in terms of assets and giving. And each one included extensive feedback from grant partners, philanthropic peers, and other stakeholders. And through those assessments, we measured the extent to which goals, strategies, and practices engaged and supported under-resourced communities to change systems and advance equity. So these reports have influenced those foundations we assessed, but doing 12 in-depth reports over 3 years, we knew we weren't going to have the broad impact in the sector that we really wanted. So we decided to develop a self-assessment tool so that foundations could ask themselves the same hard questions we were asking and also get the kinds of feedback that we were providing through the survey and interview tools that we used. And as we were working on this toolkit, we realized that we really wanted and needed to reframe it around the core concept of power. And we'll be talking more about power with the full group. So before we dig into the conversation, we want to take a quick poll. And the question is, what are the most common ways that your institution or your clients or your membership, depending on what institution you're with, receives feedback from stakeholders? So feel free to select all that apply, or if it's not applicable, you can sit this one out. But we hope that everyone will feel there's something they can weigh in on here. And Caitlin will be letting us know when the results are ready. I should also mention that we're recording this, and I forgot to cue Caitlin to do that, so I apologize, Caitlin, but hopefully we're all set with that. All right, so now we have the poll results. So interestingly, one-on-one conversations are the main way that folks are receiving feedback from their stakeholders. And it looks like grant reports run second, closely followed by surveys and site visits. And I'll just mention that two people who are also involved with the toolkit who do a lot of work with PEAK grant making, Elizabeth Myrick and Jessica Behrman, have both been doing important work on learning how grant reports are and aren't used for feedback and learning. So encourage you to check out those materials. Great, so now we're going to briefly describe, as I get the slide. There we go. Briefly describe what is this Power Moves guide that we've been talking about. Well, what it is it's a self-assessment guide for foundations and consultants to foundations to use in order to look at grant making, operations, and leadership along 3 dimensions of power. As you can see from the infographic, building power, sharing power, and wielding power. So it's not a guide to doing equity grant making, rather it's a guide to help you take stock and find out how well your foundation is using and shifting its power so that you can more effectively advance equity. And we recognize that it's not always the right time to use this kind of toolkit. It will best benefit funders who already have a demonstrated commitment or at least a stated goal to work more toward racial equity, to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusion into their operations. Foundations that are already funding some sort of social change or systemic change strategies and or are trying to make sure that their grant making benefits underserved and under-resourced communities. And in fact, the guide has a readiness assessment to help you think through whether it is the right time for your organization or for your client or for one of your members if you're a philanthropy serving organization. And in fact, one of the first things we encourage you to do in the readiness assessment is actually to review our glossary. We have an extensive glossary of terms, and some of the ones we're going to include today because they're important for today's conversation are equity, racial equity, and power. So I'll just leave that up for a second so folks can look at it. But if these are not concepts that you're even comfortable talking about with your staff or with your board, that might be a warning sign that it's not the right time yet to use the toolkit. So we're about to plunge into more about the toolkit, but first I just want to give a shout out to the many folks who contributed to this. It was a very iterative process with a lot of important input and feedback from really smart people. These are the 12 experts who served on our advisory committee. There also are 20 other practitioners who reviewed and gave feedback on an early draft, and all of that information is on our NCRP Power Moves website. So what is in the Power Moves guide? We've taken an approach that we hope is very flexible and adaptable. So there are many different entry points to using the toolkit. It can be used with or without consultant support. And we have a set of frequently asked questions that address some of those, and we'll also be discussing some of those during our panel discussion. But what it actually contains are, first of all, some important context about power and privilege. What does power and privilege mean in the context of a foundation? And how does the use or not effective use of power and privilege affect a foundation leader's understanding and comfort with risk? So really drawing that connection between power, privilege, and comfort with risk, or how one defines risk. We have descriptions of what it means to build, share, and wield power. And then for each dimension, the toolkit includes questions you can use internally, questions you can ask your grant partners and other stakeholders, and then discussion guides to help you make meaning of all this internal and external data and feedback that you've gathered. So for each power dimension, you can get a sense of where you are on that dimension, and we have visual aids to help you with that, and also what might be some next steps to take. We also talk about considerations and pitfalls in each of those dimensions of power that can help inform how you move forward. We have other tools such as the glossary that we mentioned, the readiness assessment. We have tips for soliciting feedback in a way that is really inclusive and attentive to equity issues. And then we have templates and other supplemental resources. We also have an extensive set of resources from other organizations, and we anticipate adding to that because there's always great new things that come out in the field on particularly how to advance racial equity. So we mentioned that we have these two groups, the two peer learning groups. The top set of folks there are the consultant learning group members, and then the bottom is our foundation learning group members. And we're just kicking that off this month. In fact, this webinar is our first kickoff activity. So we're excited to learn and help others adapt and use the toolkit. Okay, finally, time to get into what we're doing. So I'm going to let each of our folks in the order of Gita, Han, and Marcelo just introduce themselves and answer, tell us a little bit about how today's conversation on power and equity is relevant for their work. So Gita, please kick us off.
Thanks, Lisa. Hi, everyone. I'm Gita Galati-Parti, and my consulting practice is Open Source Leadership Strategies, which is based in Durham, North Carolina. My colleagues and I really focus on building the racial equity capacity of social justice groups, which includes foundations and funder networks, also nonprofit advocacy organizations and coalitions, and leadership development programs. And whether we enter really through the strategy door, focusing on the social justice change that a group wants to make in the world, or through the culture door, which is really an opportunity to turn the lens inward to how the group itself reflects and aligns with its social justice values, we are always exploring the sort of fundamental question of how is power operating and how could it operate in service to equity and justice. So honestly, Power Moves is right up our alley and something we've been really waiting for.
Thank you, Gita. Okay, your turn, Han.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank NCRP for creating this resource for the field, and certainly inviting the Weisberg Foundation to be a part of the Funder Learning Group and to be a part of this webinar today with all stars Lisa, Gita, Marcelo, and Caitlin Duffy behind the scenes. So the Weisberg Foundation, we're a small family foundation based in Arlington, Virginia. We've been around for about 30 years, and in those 30 years, we've funded across a variety of social justice issues, everything from education, homelessness, criminal justice, economic empowerment of women and girls, access to the arts, and the list goes on. And this has been in the DC metro area, across the US, and even some internationally. So a couple of years ago, feeling, not surprisingly, a bit scattered and wanting to set ourselves up for the next chapter of our foundation, we went through a strategic planning process, and we really started to dig into what was at the root of so many of the issues we've been funding across the years, and came to see that really at the root is inequity, and inequity in its many forms. So gender inequity, economic inequity, and in large part racial inequity. So we made the decision to center our work on equity, not only through our programs, but through our governance and our operations as well. And so now we're guided by this vision, a vision of a just world that recognizes inequities and builds access, opportunity, and power so that all can thrive. And we are committed to advancing organizations and efforts that give voice and opportunity to historically marginalized populations, in particular, populations of color, those closest to incarceration, and immigrants and refugees. And to operationalize all of this, we've done a lot to rethink and rework how we engage power to advance equity. And the Power Moves framework of building, sharing, and wielding power really resonates with us as we look to increase the intensity, the boldness, the impact of what we are doing to really push the changes we believe need to happen to achieve our vision for equity.
Thank you so much, Han. And now Marcelo, last but not least.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, NCRP, for inviting me to participate on this panel. It's an honor to be here. I just want to share kind of why this is important, why equity is important, why I'm here, and why I'm doing what I'm doing. So it all started with, I was the only person of color in a national conservation staff 18 years ago. And the challenges around that with the overt and covert racism that I experienced, and as was really trying and isolating, and I found as I continued to reach out and connect to other people of color in the environmental space, unfortunately my experience was not unique. It was a little too common. And that led me to start a nonprofit organization, the Center for Diversity in the Environment. I ran that for 10 years to really focus on diversity, equity, inclusion in the environmental movement, to help guide the movement, supporting both nonprofits as well as foundations in this space. And then that led me to this space of exploring what really needs to happen to move the mantle forward around equity in the environmental space. And that's where the opportunity to work at Meyer Memorial Trust came in a 2-year fellowship. It was really, really exciting to be there at a time when of co-creating what an equity strategy is and could look like in a private foundation, one of the biggest foundations in Oregon. And they started at that moment, specifically started a healthy environment portfolio. So just the nexus of my background around equity and the environment, where back 18 years ago, 15 years ago, I was one of the few people in the environmental space really continually pushing this space. And now all of a sudden, all these skills and knowledge that I gained, the movement in the foundation world was catching up, and actually all of a sudden I had these skills and talents that could be valuable in this space. So it was a great opportunity to do that, and so I was there for 2 years. Fellowship ended, and now bringing all my experience around serving nonprofits and foundations in the equity space came to a fore with the opportunity. Now I've been a principal at the Rayburn Group for the past 6 months now. And it's a firm that has done, a majority people of color firm, has done incredible work in the equity space for decades, supporting social justice issues and organizations through building campaigns and communication support, and now really being intentional about providing DEI capacity building support, from assessments to strategies to trainings to coaching. It's been some really exciting work being there.
Great. Well, thanks to all three of you for letting us know a little bit about yourselves and your work. So now we'll get into the heart of it and ask each of you, starting now with Marcelo, going in the other direction, with a basic question. Why does philanthropy need to look at power in order to make progress on equity today? And why are you focusing on this in your practice?
For me, the first thing that comes to mind is really to just do your work well and to be effective and impactful. In my work, I found that power and privilege often blinds us to reality. And I'll say that from my personal level of being a male. I need to check myself often. I have 2 daughters and my wife. I live in a household of women, and I am committed to do my best every day and learn every day, but I'm still getting checked and trying to learn from that. So this leads me to, we need to make intentional efforts to develop a deep equity lens, so then we can see the reality and serve in the most appropriate way that's going to be meaningful. Another reason why is from a racial equity piece, the demographics of our nation are changing rapidly. Nations, states, cities are becoming more racially diverse every day. So if we want to be, again, impactful and responsible for our work, especially in a space that has a lot of impact by distributing money in certain ways, it's the way we need to go to be effective. The other piece is, I just want to go quickly because I think it's really important to share why this work is important on the personal level too, and what drives me internally on a day-to-day basis. And I would say one is I shared my experience as an only person of color in my organization. Unfortunately, in the environmental space, which is where I have a lot of my networks, it still happens way too often. It's been happening for decades, across generations. I just spoke to 3 women of color in the past 2 months who are working at foundations and are struggling. And so if we really want to make our work more effective, not only in the programming, we need to make sure we create this inclusive culture internally and take care of our own people so we can continue to engage and bring in the smartest and most talented to do the big work that we're all hoping for. The other 2 pieces that really drive me is I have 2 daughters. They're now 12 and 15, and they were babies when I started this equity journey. And their generation, which I'm just learning now is called the Z generation, is going to be the most diverse across many dimensions of diversity, most diverse generation we'll ever see. So my question is, how are we in our foundations, in our nonprofits, in whatever institutions we're working in, how are we paving the way to create and build that foundation to allow this new generation of younger folks to take over, to lead, and take us to that next level? And then the last thing, I just don't believe we can flourish or have a high functioning society without equity. So it's essential to our work. It's not an option. It's essential to do our work effectively. And to do it, we need to be intentional about it.
Thank you. Han, for you, why does power need to be central in conversations about equity?
Yeah, so snaps to everything Marcelo said, and I'll build on that. And, I would say that philanthropy is swimming in power, reputational power, financial power, political power, but I don't think we fully reckon with what that means, so what that means to us as individuals who are working in the sector, what it means to our institutions and their place in our communities and in society, and what it means to the organizations that we exist or that we say we exist to support, right? And why is that, that we haven't really reckoned with it? I think in part because power can have a really bad rap. And I think philanthropy can have a bad rap because of how we have wittingly or unwittingly used power or squandered power to perpetuate and in some cases even perpetrate inequities. But philanthropy, the good news is that philanthropy can take a more intentional asset-based approach to power. I heard Eric Liu from Citizen University speak recently at a Washington Regional Association of Grantmakers event, and he shared 3 laws of power that really, really stuck with me, and I'll share them now. The first is that power self-justifies. The second is that power compounds. And I think these 2 laws of power kind of alone, with just those alone, things can get really dicey and dangerous real fast, right? But the third law brings, I think, really exciting potential. And the third law is that power is infinite. So power can be created, right? And so I think with an application of these 3 laws of power, that power self-justifies, power compounds, and power is infinite, philanthropy and those of us that make up philanthropy can really honestly and really opportunistically rethink how we build, share, and wield power to truly advance equity.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Geeta.
Wow, I can't take notes fast enough. This is really cool. Thank you. So yeah, I think like everybody here, the funders I work with are absolutely community oriented and also outcome oriented. And they are, dissatisfied with the outcomes that we just continue to see, whatever issue areas they're working in, whatever part of the country they're working in. you know, after I think just trying out so many different kinds of technical approaches, we've just seen that, you know, a lot of these outcomes haven't budged. And in some cases, they've really gotten worse, like the widening racial wealth gap with, you know, all the sort of related outcomes connected to mass incarceration. There's just real dissatisfaction, to say the least, I would say. So I think it's just kind of pushing the field to think, raise new questions, kind of raise new curiosities, and frankly, a real sense of urgency about the root structures, the power relationships that continue to produce these outcomes. And what's really heartening to me is that I feel like this is including, kind of for the first time, or the first time in a big way, a real just sort of willingness to turn the lens inward and explore how their own institutions are part of this power structure and also need to change if we actually want to see different outcomes in the world that are equitable and sustainable and just, you know, ultimately benefit everyone. So I really am most excited about this toolkit because for me, it feels like it matches the complexity of the challenge we're facing. And, you know, when I think about sort of just persistent racial injustice and other kinds of injustice, so often I hear from my clients, is there a checklist? We want a checklist. And I always have to be the Scrooge to say, there's no checklist. This is adaptive work. It's complex. There's no checklist. And to me, Power Moves just really, it kind of hits the sweet spot because it doesn't oversimplify and, you know, to becoming a checklist, but it does provide really concrete tools and questions and examples for funders that are really serious about equity and want to take on, they're sort of willing to take on this adaptive work that it requires.
Thank you all. Those were great answers. And I often struggle with, you know, should we lead with a values lens or kind of an impact and strategy lens? And it's all of that together. And I think you all three articulated that really eloquently. So now let's get a little into sort of when and who in terms of using the toolkit. As we mentioned, there's a readiness assessment to help folks figure that out. But as you think about using it with your own institution or with some of your clients, what considerations should a foundation or a consultant make in deciding whether now is the right time for a foundation to look at how well it's building, sharing, and building power for equity? Another way to frame the question is, you know, what preconditions and mindsets are needed for a funder to undertake this? And we'll start with Han for this one and then go to Gita.
Sure. So I think using Power Moves requires critical self-reflection, learning, planning, and ultimately action. So two key questions I think any foundation should ask in determining whether it should engage is, you know, is there the will among the board and the staff to do all of this, right? And then kind of as a follow-up, is there the time or will time be created and carved out to really make this happen in a way that's effective? So some of the preconditions or the mindset I think are really key are one, and Lisa, you've said this, an explicit commitment to advancing equity. Also a strong learning orientation, a willingness to engage in reflective practice. And as part of that is a willingness to ask for, receive, and act upon critical feedback from others, which can be hard sometimes. A readiness for change, and you know, change means the loss of something. So preparation, willingness to lose something, right? And sometimes that thing is a bad thing that you want to lose, and it's easier. But sometimes it's just something that you're comfortable with. So just preparation for change. And then, you know, building on what Gita was talking about in terms of urgency, really a nagging, urgent, deep desire for something more, something better, something that will really truly advance equity, justice, and people's lives. Because people's daily lives, the lives of their children, the lives of their grandchildren are suffering every day because of inequity. So there needs to be an urgent desire to make some kind of meaningful change.
Thank you. Gita, what do you want to add to that wonderful list?
I know it's hard to add to that, but there are a couple things I would look for. Again, going back to what we talked about a minute ago, just the orientation for adaptive change, which means I think some comfort with complexity, with ambiguity, and a willingness to really push beyond the sort of immediate and more traditional kind of technical approaches to change. And I think this really fundamentally just requires us to understand that change is really about us, our own beliefs, our habits, our behaviors, and that when we change at that really deep, profound level, that's when we really have the potential to change the context in which we're operating and which those outcomes we care about are happening. So, I think some evidence of this orientation for adaptive change is really important. And the other thing, building off a previous comment as well, is just not only a tolerance for risk, but I think an honest assessment of risk. You know, in the context of really tremendous institutionalized white privilege that all foundations hold. And I think a recognition that with that privilege comes, you know, a really deep responsibility to take risks and certainly to shift the burden of the risk off of communities, off of grantees, and think just really having the courage to pursue this imagined possibility we don't yet have evidence for. I mean, that's the really, I think, hard part, again, for organizations that are so outcome-oriented and evidence-based, to really let go of that to some degree. And, you know, honestly, if there's not a little bit of fear, if you don't feel a little scared about this work and the potential for change ahead, you're probably not quite ready for it. I think a little fear in that sort of appropriate balance is exactly what's needed to dive into this really complex and profound work.
Thank you.
Lisa, can I add a couple to there?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
And then,
Yeah. First of all, I agree with everything above that was said. I think a couple other pieces of that could determine readiness is one, is there a small group of change agents just organically being organized within the organization where they're talking about why this is important and also about the how and the thinking about strategically. They may not have the authority or the or support yet, but they're at least talking about it. I think also the role that emotional intelligence plays in this work, and we could all, emotional intelligence is not a set thing, like whether you have it or not, we could all work on it and implement specific emotional pieces to this work because it's emotional work. So we need to connect the head and the heart with this work in order to move our organizations and others forward. And I think specifically, practicing and engaging with empathy, compassion, humility, and curiosity are four specific spaces around emotional intelligence where I've seen really, to be honest, some breakthrough moments with some very difficult conversations that can happen. So there's some grounding there around emotional intelligence that can really support and uphold those conversations and the work that could easily be tense and messy, and these are pieces that could help uphold that. And then the last thing I would say, in addition to a commitment of time, is a commitment of dollars as well to this work. And whether it's bringing in consultants, I don't want it to be, you know, you don't have to hire me, and it's not I'm not self-advertising myself, but it helps institutionalize the work and also helps you be more effective. And having someone from the outside or sending folks to trainings, bringing trainers in, it just ongoingly continues to support the capacity. And as you see, start creating this line item for equity, it builds that, that support, not only now, but for the future.
I'm really sitting with how much of what you each talked about is really kind of really looking inward at a very personal level, not just at an institutional level. And I think that, you know, that can be daunting and scary. And as I think Gita was saying, you know, if you don't feel a little fear, you're probably not ready for this.
Yeah.
So as we start to think about how, you know, how can folks get started with this process, you know, knowing that it's both kind of paving the way institutionally and also paving the way sort of within each person to be ready for what may lay ahead in that self-reflection. Han, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. One of my first steps that I already took was getting buy-in from my board's executive committee and our staff. And we're small, so we have a staff of 3, but getting buy-in from folks to participate in the self-assessment and the funder learning group. And then I think the next step will be to really start socializing power moves with the full board, including sharing this webinar recording with our full board and spending some time with the board and staff at our next board meeting, really building a shared understanding of what Power Moves is, you know, the assessment, the framework, what we're doing with it, why we're doing it, and what it might mean for our culture, our work, and how we make decisions moving forward, and giving people time to ask questions and process and really own it so that it's not just me trying to push something forward by myself.
Great. So Gita and Marcelo, as you think about using this with clients, what are your thoughts about how you would get started?
Yeah, I definitely could see sharing this with really every foundation I work with. I think that all of the funders I work with have some commitment to equity, although they're at different places on their learning journey and fully understanding what that means and how it comes to life through their work and internally. So I think every organization has some strengths and some areas that need strengthening. And so to me, what I like about this is that everyone can kind of find themselves in it. I think that I don't think of the 3 dimensions as like beginner, intermediate, and advanced. I think it's all developmental, and it's just about sort of figuring out where, again, your learning curve is. So some are really going to be looking at how they want to consider ways to strengthen their equity lens and their grant making strategy, others in their relationships and processes, others in looking beyond grant making to how they influence the sort of larger conditions. There's, I think, all different entry points. And I think just even, sort of like raising the conversation about where they are in their journey and where they might want to go next is an important starting point.
Marcelo?
Yeah, gosh, so many things, so many ideas with this tool. I think for the most important thing that I'm thinking around the Power Moves is that it just creates. It's a tool that helps you start from somewhere and has just great questions in there to explore. One question can take up a half a day workshop or seminar or just discussion for the organization to address. I think overall as a tool, like, first of all, I think a starting point within it in terms of, do you start at building, wielding, or sharing power? And I think that just comes from asking the staff, where are they? What are they engaged in? What are they interested in? And by doing that also is you're all of a sudden, through this process, how do you demonstrate inclusion and equity even through the process? So how do you listen? Who are you listening to? Who are the identities even within the organization that hold power and privilege, level of the organization, different identities, sexual orientation, gender, race. So I think there's a starting point that you could start just exploring that as an organization first. I also think in terms of how it connects to what I'm excited about in terms of connecting to my consulting work is I see this as an assessment piece, really looking at where is your current reality around equity. So where's your starting point? And it can continue to be a basis in the future to measure against, to see how you're improving. I think doing this combined with creating a shared vision as an organization, like what's your desired future state around equity? Why are you even addressing this? Why is this important to you? And co-creating this desired future state, which then can connect to this current state, which the assessment is really addressing. Then you could start building in specific goals that are going to get you from the current state to the desired future state. And then, oftentimes people say, just like Gita was saying, give me the checklist. What do I need to do? And I'm like, well, where do you want to go? And where are you? And then what are your most important priorities and goals that are going to get you from point A to point B? There's actually what's going to guide you in your work. And a lot of that needs to be coming again through the process of who are you listening to internally as well as externally, which the Power Moves Toolkit talks about. How do you engage with grantees and communities? How do you listen to really engage and inform your work in a responsible way and meaningful way that's going to really provide high level value. So it's just exciting. I can't wait to get my hands on it and work with some foundations on this. It's just there's a lot of richness in there, and it's one of those tools that it's not like let's use it this one workshop or this one training or this one time. It's one of those things that you could always refer back to and start connecting to and bringing in new questions for your organization.
Thank you. So I want to return to this idea of really what it means to look internally and to think about really what we're talking about are culture shifts internally, right? Like really examining, as Hans said, we're swimming in power in philanthropy. What does it mean to shift how we view our role, our privilege, our power? And that can feel really daunting. So what is your advice for how foundations kind of approach self-assessment in a way that's sort of realistic, sort of in between we don't want the practical checklist, but we don't want folks to feel like this is so big and overwhelming, I can't see my way through it. So kind of how do you open the door to doing that deeper internal work and make it feel manageable and attainable, I guess, while being realistic and not sort of making folks think that you're going to wave a magic wand and everything's suddenly you're sharing power, you're building power, you're wielding power, and the world is a better place. Gita, you want to take that first?
It's so funny. I was just thinking to myself, this is really kind of the biggest question in a way, because the ways that you can you can't ever turn off strategy. I won't say you can turn it off, but you can sort of take a pause or coast a bit on strategy while you sort of refine your strategy and learn about, changes you want to make to your strategy. You can't ever turn off culture in any way. And it's always happening. Culture is happening even while we're doing the work to understand and change our culture. And so it's like really complicated. And so it's everywhere, it's everything, and it's also super hard to see. And we also cannot forget, just the ways culture inside of our organizations, inside of all institutions in this country and in the Western world are just highly shaped by white dominant norms. And so again, there's a direct relationship with the equity lens, the racial equity lens that we're really trying to build. It's not just about the work out there, it's also about the work in here. So, I'm basically validating that it's super hard and also super important. I feel like this is really where, I definitely don't want to deter anybody from, again, doing the strategic work, because I do feel a sense of urgency for the outcomes that are happening and our desire to change them. But I also think that it is this sort of internal culture shift inside of organizations, inside of philanthropic organizations, that just has the potential to be transformational and truly liberating in ways we can't even imagine. And then that in turn can unlock really new possibilities for the strategic work in a way that I think that sort of just focusing on the strategic work without really examining or really being willing to take that hard look and potentially make those hard changes to internal culture will always actually limit the strategic outcomes. And, the hip bone is connected to the thigh bone. And so we can't get away from it, but sort of just keeping it at arm's length at the strategy level it is, as hard as it is, easier, but in fact, I think will be limited in its impact unless we do that internal work.
Han, Marcelo, do you want to tackle this thorny question?
Sure, I'll go. Here's one approach, an approach that I work with a lot of organizations to approach the self-assessment that in a way that is realistic and provides an opening to doing deeper work internally. So one is to connect it to a change management process. And two models that are almost exactly the same, actually they are exactly the same, they just have different names, are the Loden Diversity Change Model and the Rogers Innovation Adoption Curve. And really, if you're at the beginning stages of this work in your foundation, it's really start with the change agents and the early adopters. It's usually the first 16% of the organization. So, and start there, start having those conversations, introduce this tool to the small group of folks, whether they're an informal or formal group, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is they're getting together, they're talking about this, and allow space for them to, usually you can identify the change agents by, they don't need to be, you don't need to convince them why this is important. They're ready to roll into the how and the strategy, and let's get rolling on this work. So start there, and part of that is strategizing and trying to understand, like, how can we would love for the whole organization, like you're mentioning, Lisa, to just take this building, sharing overnight, do it. In all reality, it doesn't happen overnight. So what are the stages and the next steps that you can grow into? Who is the early majority and the next folks who are there that you want to start inviting in and bringing into this process? And maybe start with a specific program or department where you want to start experimenting around, hey, let's assess, let's do this, provide this Power Moves toolkit, and for the group of folks that are in a specific department or a specific program, and just start there and allow experimentation. You know, nothing has to be set in stone, and you don't have to be perfect at it, and you probably won't. But the most important thing is you're growing and learning and moving forward. And then as you're starting to build these waves of momentum and these pockets of the organization, then eventually it'll get to this point to spread to others in the foundation. And you'll have this basis to show back, like, hey, we experimented over here and we showed some things that worked. And I think it could apply to your department, your program, and you could start going there. So those are some practical ways you can move the work forward. This is one approach.
Thank you. So we're going to start to move into opening it up to the full group, and but I want to let Han have a chance to answer if she'd like. But just also queue up folks, which I know Caitlin has done in the chat, to start feeding us your questions, comments, discussion items that you'd like to see for the remainder of the time we have together.
Sure, so I'll jump in and say, in terms of approaching this work in a way that's realistic and not too daunting, is just, think about how we approach our grant making. And when you go to start a new grant program or a program area or a grant fund, a lot of that is doing a scan to see kind of what the situation is and where there are opportunities to do something, right? So very similarly with Power Moves, it's an opportunity to scan where your organization is, and then you're not going to do everything all at once at one time, right? You're going to make some decisions around prioritizing what you can do, when, where, and how. And just much like Marcella was saying, once you have make a couple of those changes and have a few wins with that, like that can really fuel additional, deeper, further changes in the work, which can be really exciting and empowering for the foundation.
Great, thank you. So we have our first question in the Q&A bar, which says, talk about resistance from top leadership. It can be very risky to be the change agent for power sharing if the boss is implicitly opposed. And I'll just, I think this is something I was wanting to kind of get an actual debate going if we have opposing views. But some people say, unless there's a core commitment from the CEO and the board to do this, it's kind of a fool's errand to try to tread into these waters. And others say, exactly what you were saying, Marcella, like start with where there are those folks who are interested and kind of work out from there toward, getting more and more buy-in from the rest of the organization as they see the value of taking a look this way. So I guess I'm curious to know, what are folks' response about, what do you do if you're a program officer or a program director, you're thinking, oh, I'd love to do this with my portfolio, or I'm the grants manager, I'd love to do, see how we can be doing more with sharing power through the grants management system. But you're reluctant to challenge, to be in opposition to the leadership stance. Anyone want to take that one on?
Sure, I'll take it. So I do on one hand, for me, one of the readiness markers for doing this work in advancing is leadership support. And almost to a T, working with organizations, I've seen the challenge of when leadership is supportive, there's movement forward. When leadership is not supportive, it's very, very difficult. Now, saying that, I think I've seen many leaders over time start understanding the reason why equity is important to their work. So just because there is pushback or not openness at one point doesn't mean that they won't be open to the work in the future. The other thing I want to acknowledge too is sometimes, because doing this work means change work, and oftentimes there may be people in the organization, this could be your leader, that just may be opposed to change, may not be opposed to equity work. There may be a fear to change. And I've been in some organizations where I've seen some leaders who were blocking efforts because they didn't want change to happen, but they really supported equity. But they didn't, there needs to be having some discussion to understand, like, those are hand in hand. So I have seen some, worked with some organizations where it has been, and I might be working with one soon, where it's been like a bottom up approach, where a group of change agents, a group of folks that are really being very passionate about moving equity forward, or are feeling the brunt of them and their communities not being seen and supported in this work. And so there's let's get organized, let's do something, let's present something, let's make a case for this work. And I think that's the important piece, is to really develop your why this work is important for this organization. And also developing, really knowing your leader or who the folks you're influencing, what are the messages they're gonna resonate with, right? So the reason for equity, well, we're just going to make our work more effective. We're going to engage in a broader constituency. We're in the policy realm. We engage more people to support us as we go to the ballot box. All these different things. There's so many arguments there. So really developing your why, which is an essential tool, I think, for a change agent in this work, is really knowing what that why is for you. I also want to add, think about organizing and being strategic. So again, if there's a leader or certain leaders that maybe through the power dynamics, they won't necessarily listen to you, think about who they do listen to, who in the organization, as well as who externally in the organization do they listen to, and are they influenced by? And that may be more of a starting point for you. And so just continue to think about that, and don't give up. This work, this work is hard, it's trying, and the individuals that just take reins over the leadership and are really committed to continually growing their own knowledge base as well as their agency in the work. I've seen some amazing things I would have never guessed would have happened. And it all came from an individual and a group of individuals just really taking their own power in this work and moving the work forward, because they know it's the right thing to do, the just thing to do, and it's just going to make their organization and the world a better place.
Yeah. I just want to add to that. I really appreciate everything you said, Marcelo. And I think that this is another place that I feel like the Power Moves Toolkit is going to be super helpful, is having these case examples and sort of a growing body of examples
I think
to point to, so that can I keep going?
Well, you're coming in and out, but I think you're in now, so go ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Oh no.
No, we lost you again.
That, but just really appreciate.
Oh no.
Yeah, we're getting like every other half a sentence, Gita. I don't know what happened. Let's see if we can get you back on with a better connection. Because because I really want to hear what you're saying.
Mhm.
So we have about 5 or 6 more minutes, and we have several questions in the queue, and some of them are related. So, and I do want Han to get a chance to weigh in. One question I think, Marcella, you already touched on, but what happens when, maybe Han can add into this, when the diversity, equity, and inclusion work is kind of happening piecemeal throughout the organization, but it doesn't feel like there's a central strategy really driving equity throughout all the processes and practices and strategies. And then just to cue people up, is there something different about community foundations, and particularly those that have newer endowments or fewer discretionary funds, in thinking about how they would approach using the toolkit and doing this kind of work?
So happy to chime in on that first question about when there are multiple apparently disparate things happening in a foundation to advance equity. I think that's the beauty of the Power Moves assessment, right? Because you can assess what is happening at your organization and get a sense of where you are, and how you will move forward in meeting your goals. So the assessment actually might be the perfect thing to undertake at your organization. And I would imagine that, even in me reading through it and looking at it, there's a lot you are already doing. And I found there's a lot that we're already doing. I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't really give us enough credit for that. But doing that assessment will kind of help you take stock of where you are. Also kind of celebrate where you are, not in a self kind of congratulatory kind of way, but in a, we can do this. We have been doing this. We just need to do more of it and more strategically and more intentionally. I think it's actually a really a good encouragement to use Power Moves to help take you to the next level.
Gita, do we want to try to get you in on this again? And I know that you have experience also having worked at a community foundation and working with place-based foundations around that question as well.
Thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
And I'm so sorry I got disconnected for a minute here, but I actually wanted to just connect to the previous question, and maybe this will tie in as well. But I was just saying that I really appreciate that the toolkit is having this, this sort of growing body of examples that leaders can actually, point to and really just find themselves as part of a larger growing community and not feel so alone, not feel so at risk, and also just have literal examples to follow. So that to me feels really helpful with this toolkit. And I just to add to something Marcelo said before, which I loved all of his organizing strategies and totally agree with those. And I also just want to note that sometimes leadership is on board early because they don't fully understand what the change might be, and or kind of jumping on the excitement about equity, and which might be a genuine commitment and concern, but there might not be full appreciation for how much change is really needed, or how much it's going to relate to them personally. And maybe later down the path where that they start to sort of turn away. And so I just want to sort of add that I wholeheartedly agree with just the sort of support to leaders, coaching and throughout the process to kind of help them manage those kinds of feelings that they might experience. The other thing is just, noting that people in power, whether it's within an organization or whether it's, foundations in relationship to grantees or so forth, people in power have sort of the power to decide how much to engage in this power conversation. And so I think it can be helpful to formalize in some way those commitments and, kind of create a level of accountability by, for example, making a public statement about your commitment, sort of inviting other people into that commitment and holding yourselves accountable in that way. There might be even sort of, some kinds of agreements that are made and things like that. So just wanted to name those as there can be ebbs and flows in terms of leadership support for this process and different kinds of strategies that can help engage leaders at different points.
Yeah. So I'll try to get through a few more questions with our remaining few minutes of this portion, but also wanted to reassure folks that we will do a follow-up blog post, and we often will take questions from the Q&A and add those into the blog post so that everyone can see the answers. one of our plan toolkit users, the Appalachian Community Fund, said that the questions provided in the toolkit are deep and authentic and a great fit where the Appalachian Community Fund is in its development. Are there particular processes that you would recommend in engaging different constituencies? For example, a group of community people in a listening session versus incorporating the questions into the process of a board meeting. So how do you think about engagement of different constituencies around the toolkit content and questions?
I would just say that, and I forget if it was Marcelo or Gita who mentioned this, is that if, when using the toolkit, we have to be aware of how we are wielding our power and to do it in a way that is consistent with our values. So if we're asking community members or grantees to give us input, share their perspectives, that we're doing it in a way that's meeting them where they are and not being overburdensome and being sensitive to their time and kind of appreciating their expertise and their input and their time.
Yeah, and I would also add, I strongly believe in anything, most things that, at least the services that I provide, and tailoring it to the audience. So understanding and the way these questions are written or how they're delivered is really, really important. So you may want to connect to, if it's to a board, maybe there's a trusted board member that you want to, just engage and connect and say, hey, do you think this will work with the board? Or when you're engaging with a specific community or organization, maybe there's a trusted partner individual that you just want to run by the approach, the questions, the list of questions, how they're being shared, who's delivering, who's asking the questions. It really sounds like you're engaging in the how, which is a really, really important question in anything you do around equity. And oftentimes you're going to get the best answers from the very community that you're trying to serve and help. And I think it's actually as simple as that, as just asking and having that conversation.
I'm going to assert a little bit of moderator's prerogative because I feel badly about the person who asked about the community foundations, especially community foundations with small endowments and primarily donor advised funds. And I would just say that I think the beauty of this toolkit is that there are 3 dimensions of power. And so the building power section, while it mainly focuses on grant making, the wielding power and sharing power sections are really more about how you're using your own power in the community to talk about important issues like racial equity and other issues that are going on in your community. And sharing power is really about how you relate to the communities that you're seeking to benefit. So I think there's a lot in the toolkit actually for a community foundation in that kind of situation. And I think there's a lot in there that can help a community foundation think about how they're engaging their donors. How are they helping the donors to kind of ask these same questions and to think about how they're building and wielding power and sharing power. Yeah. So I do think there's a lot there, and it'll play out differently depending on each type of foundation and where you are in your own cycle of growth and development and evolution. But I think the tool is flexible enough that it will allow a foundation like that to find value in the different pieces of it.
And Lisa, thanks for going back to that. And I would just say that I think that really taking on this exploration of power actually is a means to leverage impact. So that, even maybe even more so for those who are have limited resources, there's actually a greater opportunity to engage in that work on power to have the kind of impact you want to have.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going into wrap up, but I do promise for the questions we didn't get to, which are great questions, we will follow up with those during the recap blog post. And if other folks have questions that they didn't get to ask but they think of, feel free to reach out to us and on Twitter or through email, whatever means you want, and let us know and we can add those in. Sorry, I never put up the beautiful audience discussion slide. So we're going to do one last poll, and then we're going to wrap up with final thoughts and information. So what can NCRP provide to help you, your clients, or members use Power Moves? Please weigh in with the different options that are there. And while folks are doing that, I'm just going to encourage folks, if you haven't already, to download Power Moves, read it, and let us know how we can support you to use it through one of these methods or some other one that that we haven't thought of that we would be able to do. Also, we want to make sure folks mark their calendar for the next Power Moves webinar. This is the first of a series, and the next one is going to focus specifically on the building power dimension. And that'll be on Tuesday, July 24th. So mark your calendars and keep an eye out for the registration information for that later in July. And then finally, we'll be at NFG's annual convening next week. I won't personally, but Caitlin and others will. And so if you would like to connect there, we have a breakfast happening that Thursday morning. All right, so now we've got the poll results. The peer learning group idea is very popular. That's great to hear. We're piloting it this year, but we hope that we'll learn a lot from it, and we'll learn about what is most valuable and useful, and we'll be able to hopefully build on that in future years. So that's great to know. And connecting with peers is also great to know. We're gradually going to be building up a bank of examples of foundations that do build, share, and or wield power well, and that's in the resources section of the website. So those will be potential sources of connection with peers, as well as folks who are currently in the learning group, either of the learning groups. So so we're excited to offer those resources. We can't promise we'll be able to continue the peer learning groups in a year, but hopefully we will be able to. So I think I covered most of the closing thoughts, but I was referencing NFG and wanted to make sure folks know that we're having a breakfast Thursday morning on Power Moves, so please come if you'll be there. And then wanted to just give a shout out to our partners. We built on, this toolkit couldn't have happened without all the other great, work and thought that has gone on and continues to go on, and that we continue to benefit from through our Change Philanthropy partners, such as ABFI, Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, NFG, foundations, Peak Grant Making, as I mentioned, is doing some great work on a myriad of fronts. And so we encourage you to check out the reading list, where we do list a lot of resources, and I think resources have been listed in the chat today, and we can add those to the resources list as well. If you haven't already and want to add resources into the chat, we can make sure to share that out in the final blog post. And then we're just up on our time, but I want to thank our co-presenters so much insight and wisdom that you've all shared today. I'm so grateful. Grateful to our co-sponsors, NFG and Peak. Grateful to Caitlin Duffy, again, behind the scenes, making sure that everything ran smoothly and putting so much thought into the crafting of this agenda. So you'll receive a follow-up email, as I said, with a list of resources that were mentioned in the presentation, the webinar recording, and the recap blog post. We encourage you to stay in touch with us. Let us know how we can support you in using the toolkit. And please take the survey that will come to you right after you log off, because it will really help us make sure that future toolkit webinars will be useful for you in the future. So with that said, I thank you all again. I found this very informative, and I hope others did too. And I think it's time to say goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful.